Good evening and welcome, friends. Welcome to Author Speaks program, and we have Dr. Professor Chinmay Tumbe from IIM Ahmedabad with us. He's going to speak about his book, The Age of Pandemics 1817-1920, How They Shaped India and the World. This program, the format for the program today is this. Our Principal and Director of LISSTAR, Reverend Dr. Thomas, will give his introductory remarks and then he would welcome. After that, I will introduce both the author and the team. And then Dr. Chinmay will speak to us for about 20 to 30 minutes. You are invited, you are welcome to give, to raise your questions, your comments, to write your comments and questions in the chat box. We have a technical team, they will collect it and then they will send it to us. That we will place it before Dr. Chinmay. And after half an hour, he will take those questions and respond to them. By 7:15, whenever the questions are over, we will get it. So this is the format. So may I now invite Reverend Dr. Thomas, Principal of Loyola College and Director of the LISSTAR, to give his introductory remarks and welcome address.
Thank you very much, sir. Good evening, Dr. Chenmay Tumbe, Dr. Bernardi Sami, and all the learned professors part of this book Author Speak series, and all the participants. Good evening to all of you. I think our memories are still fresh. All of us have seen the first wave in India as well as the disaster consequence of the second wave across in the Indian subcontinent, if not the whole world. So while this pandemic and its impact on all of us, much more specifically our own near and dear ones, our own family members, our memories are still vivid. Now, amidst all this human disaster, there is one particular question: why this pandemic? Is there an end to this pandemic? Why is it spreading so far and wide and taking multiple variants? While we are busy reflecting on this question, we have here with us a learned person, a person who have done in-depth reflection on this pandemic, not on the present one alone, but the previous ones. From 1817 to 1920, India has seen cholera, plague, influenza, and what kind of impact these pandemics left in this subcontinent, in the society, in the families, in the vicinity. Certainly, we have much to learn from this historical reading. And we have this acclaimed author speaking to us directly. So right at the outset, Loyola College and LISSTAR thanks Dr. Professor Chinmay Tumbe for accepting to be with us today, this evening, and also for sharing with us his rich experience and expertise in this topic. One thing I would like to share with all of you is LISSTAR is closely linked to migration. And this entire book, The Age of Pandemic, is deeply intertwined with this aspect of migration, a culture, behavior of the people. So I'm very confident this one webinar will not only deepen our understanding of pandemic and what kind of impact it's going to leave in all of us. Not only that, and what kind of substantial change it is going to bring about in our own demographic aspect as well as in our own social ethos. So I am quite eager about this particular webinar. I'm sure all of you are quite eager. As I thank Professor Tumbe and as I thank Dr. Bernard Swami for locating and taking all the efforts to get in today to speak to us. And I will also welcome all of you, my dear participants. I think a debate or discussion becomes alive and enriching only when we participants actively participate and bring life to this entire discussion. So from that point of view, I would like to invite all of you to actively take part and interact with our scholarly person who is going to be a resource person for us today. And sure, this discussion and deliberation will not only help us to understand the reality, but also prepare ourselves, prepare our future generation to face similar pandemics in the future. With these few introductory words and words of welcome, I hand over the session to Dr. Bernard Swami and to the Professor Chinmay Tumbe. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Father. Now it's a privilege for me to introduce Dr. Professor Chinmay Tumbe. Chinmay Tumbe is with the Department of Economics at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, since 2016. He holds a master's from London School of Economics and Political Science and a doctorate from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. He was a Jean Monnet postdoctoral fellow at the Migration Policy Center, European University Institute in Florence, Italy in 2013, and was with the School of Public Policy and Governance, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad, between 2014 and 16. He has worked in academic, corporate, and government institutions in India, UK, and Italy. Served on Interministerial Working Group on Migration, and his research has been featured in journals, newspapers, and policy portals. His research interests include migration studies, urban economics and business, and economic history. He has written 2 books, and I'm sure that many more are in the making. First book, India Moving, A History of Migration, published in 2018 by Penguin Viking. This is how our relationship also started with Dr. Chinmay Tumbe in CDS. And I would say that, his knowledge on migration is excellent. And that's the reason why he was member of the working group that was constituted by the union government to study the migrant workers. And that was the first book, India Moving, A History of Migration. And the second one is the present one, namely the book on the age of pandemic. The second one, the present book, is published by the Harper College. With these words, I just wanted to introduce broad theme. Dr. Chinmay has, Chinmay has named this book as Age of Pandemic. Then immediately, as a trained historian, for me this gauge was, taking me to some of the books, some of the books and some of the great works done. Particularly, I was reminded by Will and Ariel Durant. Will Durant and Ariel wrote 11 books, American historians, who lived between 1885 to 1981, the story of civilization. And each volume was running 2,500, 2,000 pages. And, he named his, each volume, Age of Walter, Age of Napoleon, Age of Faith, Age of Reason, like that he had named. And then another great historian, Eric Hobsbawm, Sir Eric Hobsbawm, England, right? And he lived between 1917 and 2012. And one of his remarkable books, many of you would remember, The Age of Extreme. 20th century, he calls it as Age of Extreme because of the 2 world wars and then the Cold War. He said that we started with the World Wars and we ended with Cold War, a short-lived century, according to him. So, whether these 2 authors were instrumental in making Chinmay to name the book as Age of Pandemic after, their title. And secondly, the book has been written so well, covering the 19th century, and lot of nuggets, lot of lot of small little things are making this book, reading, very, very interesting. Like, he talks about, during the period of, pandemic, people die and their bodies are thrown out. Now all of us are familiar with bodies floating in Ganges. In those days, it was thrown into the forest and the animals were eating. And Jim Carpet's book, he brings in, the man-eaters of Kumar. How did the, tigers and leopards, they become man-eaters? Because the bodies were there in the, forest and they started eating and then they became man-eaters. Once when they become man-eaters, take the blood of the human. After that, they, don't go for any animal, only like human. So like that, he mentions a lot of things in this book, and I don't want to advance, any, more, about this book. Now, to unpack the content of the age of pandemic, may I now invite Chinmay to do that. Dr. Chinmay.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation. Today I'll be talking about my book called The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, which should now come up on your screens as a slideshow. This is a book which was written in a pandemic about past pandemics, with the idea that maybe we can learn something about how to face a pandemic if we know about what happened in previous pandemics. And the motivation for writing this book was very simple. When the WHO announced COVID-19 as a pandemic in March 2020, a lot of people in India were quite clueless, frankly, about pandemics in general. There was a lot of bewilderment. People were amazed. I had WhatsApp forward saying, nothing can happen to us. We are naturally immune because we have fantastic diets. There was a lot of chatter about how no pandemics have ever originated from India. All pandemics have originated in China. There was just so much chatter that when I compared these observations with my own research on migration, in which I had encountered so much on pandemics in the 19th and early 20th century, I thought there was a huge opportunity to write a book to basically inform the public about our own tryst with pandemics. And it turns out, of course, India was the worst affected country in the world in 3 massive pandemics, the cholera, plague, and influenza pandemics. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour, 35 minutes to give you a flavor of the book, some of the key themes, key issues, and be happy to take questions after that, especially in connection with COVID-19, because I'm also working on various aspects of COVID-19 right now. But I'll start this conversation with 2 aspects of what we are seeing in COVID-19 and to kind of motivate as to why history is so important. This is an image on your screen which kind of shows you one of the shocking visuals of last year, where we had a migration crisis. Some of you will remember in April last year, people were walking back home, out of desperation because there was no economic security in the cities. Many landlords and landladies had thrown people out. And then, of course, the trains were not there. And so people were forced to walk back home. But I'm going to show you another image, which was taken, which was in 1897. And it's an identical image there. It's an image from, more than 100 years back, taken during the pandemic plague, also depicting migrant workers living in a city. Right? And if you see the expressions in these 2 images, on the left, the woman carrying the child, on the right, the man carrying the child, there's the same sense of anxiety, of grief, of depression, of insecurity, and the impulsive kind of reaction that when a health crisis emerges in the form of a pandemic, the first response of India's big circular migrant workforce, this is a workforce which has 1 leg in the city, 1 leg in the village, is to go back home. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that, of course, you'll see on the left that people are scrambling across in a train, and the British, for all their other faults, which I'm going to list out at some length, had the kind of foresight to say that, look, these migrants, it's going to be tough to stop internal migration. Let's arrange special trains so that they get back home. Now, the Indian government did the same thing last year, but unfortunately, we were about 2 months late. Remember the Shramik train started only in the month of May. And so for about more than a month, we had this massive migration crisis, which in my view was unnecessary. And I now know that, of course, people who were part of the policymaking exercise, after getting to know the history, have kind of realized some of these policy failures of last year. And of course, you'll see that this year we did not have a full-blown migration crisis. like we had last year. Because why? Because in 2021, we have learned the lessons of 2020. If only in 2020 we had learned some of the lessons of the past. So it's generally not a good idea to shut down the trains with, for example, a 4-hour notice period, because migrant workers, who do want to go back home, their incomes dry up, their holding capacity in our cities is very, very low. I'll come back to this point on migration later, but I'm just trying to motivate the discussion of the similarities between pandemics of the past and pandemics of the present. This is the second image I want to show you, which is most topical right now, because I think all of us have lost somebody or the other, in this devastating second wave of COVID-19 right now. And of course, if you, just saw human behavior of all of us collectively as a country in January and February of 2020, it was almost as if the pandemic is over. It was almost as if nothing can happen to Indians. Our per capita deaths were low in 2020 compared to, say, USA. And so there was a lot of narrative that things had the pandemic is over. But the one thing we know from past pandemics is actually pandemics do come in waves, and one has to ride those waves very cleverly. This is a chart from the deadly 1918 influenza pandemic, popularly known as the Spanish flu, though it had really nothing to do with Spain. And this is a chart which shows you deaths on the y-axis. Each line is a district, and the thick lines represent the provinces. This happened in 1918. And you'll see the first wave is very mild in April and June, and then it skyrockets. And the reason I'm showing this chart is because if only policymakers had seen this chart or were well averse with what pandemics can materialize into, we would have been much better prepared, I would argue, for the second wave. In fact, many of our officials, enterprising officials, did see what was happening around the world and realized the possibility of the second wave and started investing in very few cases, but they did start investing in ramping up oxygen facilities, keeping the specialized treatment centers open, even after cases started coming down in September. And what I'm trying to show out here is that, the pandemic waves can be very devastating, and they can come very, very quickly in a matter of a few weeks. This is the second wave out here that you're seeing on the chart is a crazy rise from the first wave. Right? And so one has to always, once a pandemic is set, one has to always be careful about future potential waves. Now, why I've written this book is two reasons. One is that, as I pointed out, there are lessons of the past. For example, anticipating waves, which I just showed you. For example, anticipating reverse migration. There are just so many policy lessons that we can learn from the past. Another reason is simply of interest for a person who does history, for example. That is, when we learn history in our school textbooks, we often see this period of our history, 1817 to 1920, as some sort of a rise and fall of British rule kind of a period. What we do in school is mostly political history. What I'm arguing in this book actually that while we learn stuff like nationalism, capitalism, globalization, and so on, a big chunk of this history is also about a massive demographic shock which Asia received, and India in particular, such that Asia's share of global population in this period falls from around 65% to 50%. And a part of that fall is because of deadly pandemics, which had a disproportionate impact on Asia. Right? And we really don't learn about these pandemics in our history. It's almost like people are going around in their daily business. But what I'm arguing is that for much of this period, life expectancy rates were at birth only in the 20s, which means you could expect to live only 20 years or so at birth. And that figure was actually falling, which means death rates were increasing after 1870. This was a terribly tough time to live in India. And I'll go through some of these pandemics and why they were so deadly. So here's a quick snapshot of all the pandemics: cholera, plague, and influenza. Cholera and plague are bacteria-based diseases, and that is why antibiotics, which were discovered in a big way in the 1940s, became very effective as a weapon against those diseases. Influenza, as we now know, is a virus, but when it hit in 1918 in a big way, people thought it was bacteria because the science of virology had not yet developed. Now, cholera and plague had case mortality ratios initially of more than 50%. Plague was 80%, which means if you got plague, there was an 8 out of 10 chance that you would die. Right? Influenza was less lethal. Case fatality ratios were typically under 10%, but it was much more viral. Right? So it transmitted much more. Cholera and plague were more ghastly diseases because you could see the impact on people's bodies. Influenza, like COVID, is a more kind of an invisible disease. You don't really, you get a fever, but you don't really get to see the disease in a very direct sense. And you'll see that 1920 is some sort of a magical date. It's not the case that, of course, cholera and plague vanish after 1920. But the fact is that they diminish. And so after 1920s, the revolution in science and many other factors lead to a reduction in many of these pandemics. And in India, if you consider HIV/AIDS as a separate kind of a pandemic, what we are facing now is literally the first major pandemic after 1980. And in 1918, India lost 20 million people, or 2 crore people, as per my estimates, in that pandemic, or 6% of the population. This is the worst demographic shock ever received by India in recorded history. And it's really a surprise that the influenza incident is not taught in our schools, because this is really one of the worst periods of our history. In fact, we tend to remember more, for example, of the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy of April 1919, which killed a few hundred people. But influenza, which killed 20 million people just a few months before that, do not really figure in our history textbook. So you'll see in these figures, over 70 million people died. This is about the same toll as World War I and World War II. And as Professor Bernard Sammy was pointing out, Eric Hobsbawm wrote that book, The Age of Extremes, and so on. What I find interesting is that precisely because these pandemics hit India disproportionately more, these pandemics hit Asia disproportionately more, global histories which are written from a Eurocentric perspective have kind of missed out just how central pandemics were in this particular period. That is why, if you look at Eric Hobsbawm's periods, there's virtually no mention. There's 1 or 2 mentions of cholera, but there's really no mention of, for example, these big events like the influenza or plague. Right? And so these are, I would say, big tectonic shifts which shaped a lot of India and a lot of the world. And India was the most affected country in absolute terms in all the pandemics. So I'll start now with some images. I'm going to show you a lot of maps, photographs, images, and less of statistics. But this is how cholera really breaks out in 1817. And that is why this book also starts with 1817. Cholera has always been around. It was kind of endemic, which means it was always there in Eastern India. But it kind of breaks out in an unusually virulent form in 1817. And you'll see the dates marked on this map refer to the month and the year. It breaks out in August 1817 in Eastern India, around Jessore, Calcutta. And then it reaches Ceylon or Sri Lanka down south by January 1890. Right? So this is an epidemic outbreak which takes about 1.5 years to go from Eastern India to Southern India. So that's the first thing, that in the early 19th century, because there was no railways, at this time, there's no railways, there's no steamboats, it took time. And how did it transfer? It transferred mostly, people would say, through military and troop movements, because this is also the backdrop of the Anglo-Maratha wars and so on. Now, at that time, Western medical traditions did not really offer any systematic advantages over, say, Ayurvedic traditional forms of medical knowledge in India, Unani, Siddha, a variety of things, what we would now call as Ayush. So it didn't really matter what medicines you're prescribing, they all seem to be equally useless against this unusually virulent strain of cholera. At that time, most medical traditions thought that diseases are caused by impurities of the air, what is known as the miasma theory of diseases. We now know that cholera is mostly a waterborne disease, but this was thanks to John Snow's experiments in 1854. And before that, people were clueless. They thought that it's the air that's causing the disease, when we now know that it was the water. So it had to wait for a paradigm shift in the science of understanding diseases to really nail down cholera. And so cholera really starts, destroying a lot of places around the world in the meantime. This is how a cholera patient would look. It was a deadly disease. You could die within 4 hours of getting it sometimes. It's basically a disease of dehydration. You lose a lot of water from your body. You have sunken eyes. You often turn blue. It's quite a deadly disease. And the eventual cure came about only in the late 20th century in the form of what is now known as ORT, or oral rehydration therapy. So if you're dehydrating, the solution then is to rehydrate your body, especially with salts. And so that's become one of the most cost-effective ways to battle cholera. This is an image which shows you as cholera hits Europe. So from India, it starts going around. It goes to China, it goes to Japan, it goes around the world. And that's why we call it a pandemic and not an epidemic. Remember, the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic is about how wide and how simultaneously it is spreading around the world. And cholera starts hitting Europe in a big way. This is a map, cartoon which kind of shows you, and it represents the overabundance of useless advice concerning protection against cholera. And because nothing really seemed to work, because nobody had really figured out what is the disease. Because unless you understand the transmission of a disease, you really are, groping in the dark about how to prevent that particular epidemic. This is when cholera hits the America or USA. It takes the life of a president of USA, not while he was serving, but just after he had left office. It devastated New York City, many cities of America. It's a cartoon which shows you the economic impact of pandemics. The fact that people flee the cities means rents have to come down because nobody is living in those places anymore. And so this is a classic cartoon, depicting that. Now, what's interesting is that as cholera moves out of India, it is no longer just called cholera. It is called Indian cholera. Just like a lot of people call it as the Chinese virus today. Of course, we should know that diseases can start from any part of the world, and there was nothing really Indian about cholera in that sense. And cholera became endemic in many other parts of the world later on. This is an image from Egypt. Kind of shows you the deadliness of cholera in Egypt. Egypt was a country most affected by cholera in terms of percentage of population. Something like 10% of its population in the 19th century was wiped out, in the middle of the 19th century by cholera. And another country really hit by cholera was Russia. And I'm showing this image of a quarantine system because it comes very close to a word which we use a lot nowadays, which is lockdown. The word lockdown was not really used in the 19th century, but the word quarantine was used a lot. And it kind of shows you, the people standing on the bridge out here practicing what we would now call as social distancing or physical distancing. The reason I'm pointing out this map is, the fact that Russia was hit a lot. The famous music composer Tchaikovsky, for example, dies of cholera. So does his mother. But the fact that cholera was such a dangerous disease across the world. Remember, Marquez wrote a famous book, Love in the Time of Cholera, to denote a particular epoch in South American history. This is a disease which goes around the world, and it evokes a response from many of the imperial European countries to stop the pandemic. Right? And in 1851, they start a conference, and that conference happens again and again and again to kind of figure out ways to stop the spread of cholera from one place to another. And they experiment various things over the next 50 years. Those conferences eventually culminated into something which we now all know as the World Health Organization, which was established in 1948. So the roots of the WHO actually lie in efforts to combat cholera reaching Europe from India. And that first conference was 1851. Now, cholera was shown to be a waterborne disease in 1850s by John Snow. But interestingly, this was not really accepted by most or many medical officers, especially the British medical officers in India, who stubbornly held that cholera is airborne for nearly 4 more decades. So while Europe invested heavily in purification of water, so the way cholera works is what is known as a fecal oral transmission system, which means you ingest contaminated water with cholera bacteria, you then have a discharge, and if the sewage then mixes with the drinking water, that's how it comes back into our system. So you want to keep the sewage very, very different from drinking water, and most importantly, you need to have clean drinking water. Unfortunately, in India, a lot of the wells and water sources are contaminated with cholera, and so MC Fernell, used a very interesting logic to kind of argue that cholera is a waterborne disease as late as in the 1880s. Remember, John Snow had already shown this in 1850s, but the Indian bureaucrats were so stubborn in their insistence that cholera is airborne that they kind of kept on to this theory for many decades. And MC Fernell had to use this map in which one side of the street shows the so-called high castes, the other side of this village shows so-called low castes in South India. And he says that, look, only well A and well B, only the high caste used water from there and they drank water from there. And in this particular village, it's the high caste, so-called high caste, who got contracted cholera. Whereas the people on the other side of the street actually did not contract cholera. The one person who did was the washerman, who happened to go on the other side. So classic kind of experimental proof using a village level map to argue about the waterborne nature of cholera, which was finally accepted by Indian medical authorities only really in the early 20th century. right? And so it's a classic example of how if you're steeped in a particular scientific paradigm, very stubborn, and you don't move to the next big thing which seems to experimentally work, then you can cost the lives of millions of people. I move now to vaccination, which is the hot topic in India today. Vaccination starts in a big way thanks to smallpox, but the huge hero in the age of pandemics in India in the story of vaccination, long before the Poonawallas and the Serum Institute of India, was something called as the Haffkine Institute, started by the gentleman in the center of this picture called Valdemar Haffkine. And Haffkine comes to India to test his cholera vaccines. He's running these experiments. He's arguing that it's effective, and there's a very slow uptake of these vaccines. He is then asked to stay on in India for more time, and he develops plague, a vaccine against plague, and his lab in Bombay is eventually converted into what is even today called as the Haffkine Institute. And the Haffkine Institute has now been pressed by the government of India to produce a Covaxin by next year. Now, the Haffkine Institute was as big in terms of its global stature, just like we are seeing Serum Institute of India today. And it's interesting that the Serum Institute is now widely known, but nobody really knows much about the Haffkine Institute. And 100 years back, the Haffkine Institute was exporting plague vaccines around the world. What's also interesting is that the roots of India's vaccination prowess, the fact that India, unlike so many other developing countries, has access to vaccines and so on, is because precisely of people like Valdemar Haffkine. And so there's a direct root, just like I said, the WHO traces its roots to 1851 to combat cholera. India's vaccination prowess today traces its roots to people like Valdemar Haffkine. In fact, the Poonawallas, who run the Serum Institute of India, they were not into vaccination, they were into horse breeding. And they got into vaccination only after getting in touch with the Haffkine Institute. And it's that interaction with the Haffkine Institute that led them to backward integrate and get into vaccine manufacturing. It's in fact a good case to be made that if Valdemar Haffkine had never come to India, we would probably never have had the Serum Institute of India today. Cholera is eventually, won through a variety of efforts. As I pointed out, John Snow is the first person who points out in a systematic way the waterborne theory of cholera, as a result of which prevention of cholera becomes easier, because if you drink clean water, then you cut out the chances of getting cholera. Robert Koch identified the bacteria systematically. Leonard Rogers, a medical officer in India, cut down case fatality rates from more than 50% to much less under it, using intravenous saline method, IV treatment methods to basically conquer cholera in a systematic way. And finally, it was an Indian scientist working in Calcutta who ought to have won the Nobel Prize, but unfortunately he didn't, Sambhunath Dey, who really figured out how cholera attacks the human body. And it's thanks to his work that we now have powerful vaccines, we have ORT, we have a good understanding of cholera thanks to his scientific work done in the 1950s. So today we are saying cholera is no longer a dangerous disease. How did this pandemic end? It ended through a combination of prevention and cure. Prevention in the way of clean water systems, and cure in the sense of vaccines, cure in the sense of oral rehydration therapy. So today we are not so bothered about cholera anymore. I now move on to plague, which was a disease which has been there throughout humanity. Famously, the Black Death episode in 14th century, which killed off maybe 1/3 of Europe. Plague also hit London. Plague has hit many Indian cities and places around throughout history. But the British go overboard when plague hits Bombay city in 1896. And most likely it had come to Bombay via China. Now, the plague is a disease we now know which comes to human beings from rodents or rats via the bite of a rat flea. That is, as plague kills rats, rat fleas get hungry and they look around for things to bite, and they bite human beings, and that's how the plague bacteria enters the human body. Now, none of this was known really before 1905, which means for the first 10 years when plague hit, people were pretty much doing, for example, what we were doing last year, saying, "Go Corona, go," praying for the disease to go back. And this is an example of people praying for plague to go back when it first hit Bombay and the region around Bombay in the late 1890s. The biggest legacy of the plague, of course, is a piece of legislation and a massive surveillance system that the British tried to impose precisely because the British had the plague hugely entrenched in their collective memory. Remember, plague had devastated London in the 1660s. That is why when plague hit Bombay, the British went overboard. And the piece of legislation they came up with is something called as the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. Now, this is a piece of legislation which we are still using today to battle COVID. Again, a direct link between what we are doing today and the age of pandemics. And this is the kind of stuff people would do. We saw images like this last year, unfortunately, as well, people being disinfected in pretty brutal ways. Despite what we now know, plague, none of these methods would actually work against plague. What one needed was effective proofing against rodents. An example of a temporary hospital for plague victims, which opened up in massive numbers around that time. I'll talk a little bit about this map. It's a map which shows where plague really hit India. And you'll see that it hits India really in a few places, which is Bombay Presidency along the Western Ghats. It hits, pretty much along the Ganga. It's from Punjab, United Provinces, or Uttar Pradesh, and so on. Now, the reason I'm showing this chart is because one has to be very careful when one makes claims about regional variations in mortality in a pandemic. And it has huge relevance because you'll remember that for much of last year, many of us would have conversations about why is COVID-19 affecting Western countries so much and not India? And we all concocted our own hypotheses. My favorite one, which I've heard, is what I call the Pani Puri hypothesis, which basically says that if you can eat Pani Puri outside in the streets of India, you kind of get some immunity, which saves you against all sorts of diseases. Now, this is, of course, scientifically, completely invalid. There is really no scientific proof against it. And what this chart tells you is not to celebrate the absence of an epidemic in your area, because it could quite well be just plain good luck. In this case, it later turned out that the disease ecology for plague, the particular kind of rat, the particular kind of rat flea was more prevalent. The particular climate that was required was much more prevalent in these parts than other parts of India. So when Calcutta and Madras exclaimed that they had conquered plague, they had not really conquered plague. They had just got lucky in the sense that plague was not really conducive in those particular regions. And that is why, there's so many things we still do not know about coronavirus that we have to be very careful in our speculations about why it is hitting some parts of the world and others before rushing to very premature conclusions such as natural immunity, which the second wave of COVID-19 has shown to be completely untrue, since so many hundreds of thousands of people have died. An example of a plague vaccination certificate back then, since many of us are getting these certificates today as well. Plague went around the world, but did not really hit countries as hard as in India. I'm showing this image from Brazil, where it really inspired a massive movement on public health out there. And so the roots of modern public health systems in Brazil are also kind of linked to plague. An example of early PPE, since that's in vogue nowadays, this is from China, which was hit by the plague in 1911. And I'll talk a little bit about this because it's interesting in terms of the impact on migration. In 1911, just like in India last year, the Chinese authorities shut down the railways for migrant workers. So here's an interesting example of history of a policy response. And what do you think happened back then in January 1911 in the freezing winter? People still wanted to go back home and they walked, and many of them died because it was winter in China in January 1911. Right? It again goes to show you that we had examples from history that if you shut down transport networks very abruptly, you can actually lead to a humanitarian disaster. And so if we had known of this incident last year, maybe you would have thought twice about how to roll out our national lockdown last year. Plague as a disease went out due to many reasons, partly also because of herd immunity among rodents, due to which it stopped coming to human beings. But by the 1940s, there were antibiotics, there was DDT sprays. By the 1960s, plague kind of goes out of fashion in India. And barring a small outbreak in 1994 in Surat, plague has gone out of the global consciousness. A lot of people were involved in that. Women have a huge role to play as frontline workers, nurses. And I show you here the, Savitribai Phule as an example, who, fantastic social activist, who took a lot of time and effort to open clinics for plague victims, and herself actually succumbed to the disease. You have people like Kita Sato, people like Yersin, who identified the bacteria. And you have a remarkable personality, William Liston, who was born in Secunderabad, was part of the British Medical Service, who actually figured out how plague was transmitted. And it's thanks to his kind of pioneering research that showed this link between rats to humans via rat fleas. Now, this was a breakthrough because remember, plague has been hitting humanity for centuries. And it is thanks to Liston's work, thanks to people like, Kitasato Yersin, that we now know how to act against plague. So eventually it all boiled down to rat proofing, to basically keeping the rats away from human beings. That became a classic prevention mechanism. And one way that this was done was through evacuation. So between 1900 and 1910, plague, which was a seasonal disease, whenever it came for a few months of the year, people would simply evacuate entire villages and small towns and camp outside during the night because they realized that plague is very operational, the transmission during night. So this was traditional wisdom, and the British appreciated it and started enforcing these evacuation policies. Finally, I'm going to come to influenza, which is the most deadly pandemic in history, especially for India. And I've already shown you it came in two waves. Most likely it started in America, more likely that it was the American flu rather than the Spanish flu. But this was also the context of World War I. Spain was a neutral country, and that's why it was reporting more information on the flu, and that's how it got the name the Spanish flu. But the second wave was devastating around the world. It kind of mutated, most likely it mutated into a very lethal strain, much more transmissible and very lethal. I've argued in that book that India also got caught out, especially in Western and Northern India, because of India's third worst recorded drought on history. So we unfortunately got a double whammy. We got a drought, a really bad drought between June and September 1918. And on the back of that drought, when food prices were already surging, we got influenza. So influenza worked and picked upon, seriously malnourished bodies and killed off, in my estimates, 20 million people. So it's a huge number of people who died. This was a newspaper article in 1919 when the first census, that time, like today, they had a daily dashboard of how many people were dying. But that dashboard was limited to hospitals or individual cities. So you could see, for example, how many people died in a day in Bombay City, for example. But nobody really aggregated it up like how we are aggregating it today. And the initial number was 6 million deaths. We now know that the actual number was much more, and my estimates are 20 million deaths. We know because the census identified very few people in the villages in 1921 and so on. And the reason I'm putting it out there is because we're dealing with a very similar situation today, where the reported number of COVID deaths, especially in the second wave right now, is about 200,000. But what we researchers are finding is that the actual number of COVID deaths is likely to be many, many, many times more. Right? Just for 4 states of India, we are finding that in the first 5 months of this year, there were more than 500,000 excess deaths. That is, deaths which were much more than pre-pandemic times happening. Right? And so if it's just 500,000 plus for 4 states of India, which is about 20-25% of India's population, then you can only imagine what is the actual kind of toll that COVID has taken in India. And that is why good data management is very important in a pandemic, because if you don't keep track of good metrics, you fail to control and curb a pandemic. This is just a map to show you how influenza hit Western and Northern India much more. This is a map shown in current day jurisdiction boundaries. Pandemics have huge economic implications. Just as we are seeing COVID-19 devastate our economy today, create more inequality where a lot of economic hardship is there for the poor, a lot of people have lost jobs, unemployment rates are surging. 1918 was actually the worst economic year we have ever recorded in Indian history. This is a chart which shows on the x-axis GDP growth rates, on the y-axis inflation. And you'll see that 1918 is like an outlier. It's a year in which India recorded minus 10% or GDP growth and about 30% inflation. It was India's greatest supply side shock ever, and the impoverishment was immense. 2020, interestingly, is somewhere there. We're saying about 8% contraction, 7% contraction, and 5 to 10% inflation. So it's interesting that the 2 worst years of economic history in the last 20 years are actually both pandemic-related years. And that's why economic students actually have to be paying more attention to pandemics, because clearly pandemics are one of those crazy events which completely knock out the economy because you're forced into lockdowns. Remember, in 1918, there was no national lockdown. But even without an enforced lockdown, when a pandemic runs wild, people are either too infected or too scared to venture out. So what you get is a state of an effective lockdown, and nobody simply reports to work. Right? So even if the government doesn't actually enforce a lockdown, in a raging pandemic, you often get a situation of a de facto lockdown. Just to kind of wrap this discussion up slowly, an example of public health protocols back then, you'll see how similar it is to today. Wear a mask, have good sanitation, etc. But the one word that they use here, which was not used much in 2020, but which is now making a comeback in 2021, is ventilation. The WHO has interestingly only now said that ventilation is an important part of dealing with COVID. We really didn't pay enough attention to ventilation in 2020, but interestingly, in 1918, this was hugely mentioned. So, what are some of the legacies of the age of pandemics? Why should we remember those pandemics? One is, of course, that many of the public health interventions we are now doing around the world started in the first place. Modern science, modern bacteriology started in a quest to curb the pandemics of the past. Right? Our entire edifice of modern science, think of John Snow's groundbreaking work on cholera, is attributed with this quest to curb pandemics. In India, of course, I've discussed the legislation we are using for COVID-19 started from plague, vaccine development for the Poonawallas. The link is to Valdemar Haffkine. But there are some others which people might not associate. For example, the fact that our urban development authorities started in the context of the plague. Madras Improvement Trust, Bombay Improvement Trust, the first improvement trusts of the early 20th century was started in response often to pandemics. Stuff like cooperative movements, the organizational leadership that was involved in pandemic management meant that a lot of solidarity was built, and that gave a fillip to India's cooperative movements. In those pandemics, because so many people died as a percentage of population, it was much more devastating back then than today, right? And so, for example, influenza, 6% of Indian population knocked down. Strangely enough, gave much more voice to workers. Because remember, this balance of power between capital and labor can get altered in a pandemic. Often actually labor, the surviving labor benefits after a pandemic because they have more bargaining power. What we're saying is that there's a labor shortage, which can often drive up wages and bargaining rights. And that's exactly what we saw in the 1920s. That is, workers got many more rights, and India's labor movement really kicks off from then. And finally, we often learn about freedom movement, about leaders like Gandhi, Sardar Patel, people like Tilak, people like Gokhale. The fact is that a lot of these leaders earned their stripes really in pandemic management. Sardar Patel's first big job in public policy was in the city I'm based in right now, Ahmedabad, as a person of the sanitation committee of the municipality. And he was pressed into plague service in 1917. Think of leaders like Gokhale, Tilak, hugely involved in plague management during the outbreak in the late 1890s. Think of the 1857 uprising that we learn in our school textbook. Very few people know that it happened on the back of a massive cholera outbreak. And this research which shows that garrison towns with more of those outbreaks actually saw more mutinies back then. So how do we appreciate the current pandemic in light of what we have seen in the past? The first is to appreciate the fact that pandemics can originate at any place at any time. Now, there's a lot of theories as to how the COVID-19 pandemic has started. The two theories really are now based on a transfer from bats to humans somewhere around Wuhan. But there's also a theory of a lab leak, which has now got more acceptability in the last few weeks because of a lot of kind of a cover-up kind of operation that seems to be happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But the balance of evidence right now really does not confirm the lab leak hypothesis. So it is still open speculation. But the larger point is that pandemics need not always originate in one country. We've seen cholera originated in Eastern India. We've seen arguably the 1918 influenza was the American flu. And so it really does not make sense to add the country name towards the disease. And we should understand diseases by the disease properties and not the country name. So let's not call it the India variant or the Chinese virus. Pandemics and migration are very closely related. In a sense, you cannot have a pandemic without some migration, because migration, whether it's of human beings, of birds, of rodents, that is the way in which these epidemics spread. And that is why pandemics do require the curtailment of mobility. But how do you do it? That is the important policy question. And here I would argue that it's much simpler to curtail international mobility by just shutting down your airports, shutting down your ports. But you really can't do that with internal mobility or internal migration. And the big learning from the past is that you have to be very sensitive to the needs of migrant workers. So while a person stuck in London can't really swim all the way back to India, a person stuck in Chennai, for example, can walk back all the way to Bihar. And our state boundaries are very porous. So we have to be very pragmatic. We have to roll out massive social security to our migrant workers during a pandemic, especially as lockdowns announced, and also give the option for migrant workers to go back. And we have to be sensitive to their concerns. There will always be politics around pandemics. That's what I document in my book. People will always use the worst countries as the benchmark. The correct thing to do is to look at good metrics, not just the reported numbers on COVID, but try and get a sense of what the actual impact is on the ground level. And that is why we need better data to manage the pandemic and less of politics. There will always be conundrums on why some parts of the world, some parts of India are hit more than others. We have to be patient. We still don't know too much, and we should not jump to conclusions. For example, the conclusion many of us, thought by us, I mean the general public, that in Jan and Feb, India had escaped COVID-19 because of our great immunity. Now we know from the events of April and May that that was clearly wrong. We should not be jumping to fast conclusions to that. Finally, I'll end by pointing out that when I looked at these past pandemics, it does seem like a pattern of denial, of confusion, followed by acceptance, and then an erasure. Unlike wars, unlike earthquakes, unlike floods, pandemics are strange events which take a lot of lives, but also are erased from our public memory very quickly. Just see what's happening today in June. We've come out of this brutal second wave, but already we feel that the pandemic is behind us. We want to put it behind us, which is fine, but we should not forget it in our collective memory. Because the more we forget, the more we make the same mistakes the next time the pandemic comes around. And that is why we need to invest in good systematic documentation of the current pandemic, including past pandemics, to take kind of the best policy lessons from them. For example, one of the things that the BMC did in Mumbai recently was something called as a chase the patient policy. That is, rather than the patients coming to the hospitals, why can't the municipal administrators go to houses and treat patients so that you reduce the load on hospitals during a pandemic? Now, that's exactly what Bangalore did more than 100 years back during the influenza pandemic. It's a very similar variant of what we would now call as the chase the patient policy. And I would argue that the less we erase the past memory, the less likely we will be in denial mode the next time the pandemic comes around. So with that, I'll end here. Be happy to take questions. I run a social media handle called BizEconHist on business and economic history on Instagram and Twitter. And I also run a history internship at IMA. And the details of all of this are online. If anybody's interested, you can check it out online. So with that, I'll end here and be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Chinmay. That was a wonderful presentation. History and contemporary scenario and future directions, all put together. Excellent presentation on pandemics. Now, to begin our discussion, we have a few questions. I will read out those questions to you. You're able to hear me, right?
Yeah.
Chinmay? Yeah. Okay. Malnutrition did appear to be a factor of importance during pandemics. Nourishing food is a ready digest in a steadily digestible form. So it is a question connected with that. Secondly, it is amply clear that the viral influenza comes in waves. Any suggestions to policymakers for future waves? And the third one is, rural areas are more prone. More or less they are insulated during the first wave. And whether any such a trend noticed during the pandemics? Any such trends are noticed in the pandemic time? Yeah.
Sure.
Rural areas are the insulated.
Yeah, that's a great set of questions. All really thought-provoking. I'll start with the one on nutrition.
Sure.
It's very important that in a pandemic, a pandemic management involves hard trade-offs, and all of us know this very, very hard trade-off involved what we now call as the lives versus livelihoods trade-off. Yeah. The fact is that as the livelihoods start disappearing during lockdowns, restrictions, and so on, there is no doubt that people cut back on consumption, especially of food. And there's no doubt that people start also reducing nutritional intakes, which means that you're more susceptible during lockdowns. In order to curb a pandemic, you often expose people to other diseases because of that undernutrition. So there's a very hard trade-off involved. And that's why you need to have a balanced view of pandemics. You can't just say, like last year, national lockdown, and just say that we have to contain the pandemic, nothing else can be done. And that is why we need to have good social security measures in place. Now, it's heartening that, this year and last year, we've been sitting on record food grain stocks. A lot of that has been through the National Food Security Act made public. So we are in a very different context in 2021 compared to the age of pandemics of the past, which I've documented in my book. Because remember, that time, India had a massive water scarcity because we had 3 horrible droughts, one in the 1870s, one in the 1890s, and one in 1918. These were much worse than anything that we've recorded since. So these were truly spectacular droughts. The 1877 drought led to something called as the Great Famine of South India. So these droughts regularly, every 20 years or so, created a scarcity of water, and with that, a scarcity of food production, which led to a very fragile nutritional kind of equilibrium in India. And that is why pandemics of those times picked off many more people than, if people were well nourished. So it's absolutely clear that you need to have a good focus on nutrition in pandemic management, because the restrictions that one takes to reduce the intensity of the pandemic, think of the national lockdown last year, restrictions this year, will push millions of people in India, unfortunately, towards poverty. And with poverty comes, crunching nutritional intakes. So that is why, you have to have those free rations for many months. You have to have the PDS in full support. You have to have the Manrega. You've seen last year the Manrega, activities going up through the roof, and all the social security has to be up. So it has to be a balancing act. You're trying to cut down transmission, but you don't want to, have a section of population opened up to other diseases. That's an excellent point. And I do think on that note, broadly the government of India and the various state governments of India have been mostly on the right track. I've been very critical of various governments on a variety of things, but I think the focus on nutrition, I think has been there at some level. Unfortunately, millions of jobs have, gone out. And so people will be cutting back on consumption expenditure. As long as we're not creating famine-like situations, hopefully, like what happened, in 1918, for instance, it's very unlikely that will happen now, because we're sitting on millions of food grains of excess stocks, the Food Corporation of India. And that's the big learning. The difference between 1918 and now is that we have those excess food grain stocks. In 1918, there's simply no food. So there's the pandemic and the drought. There's a bad kind of combination to have happened. So nutrition matters, yes. The second question on waves. Pandemics come in waves, we know that. Now it seems, I should also say, it's some of these things about pandemics seems obvious post facto, right? That is, now after April and May, yes, anybody can say, yeah, pandemics come in waves, right? But the point is that this was known to a lot of us who work on this topic, in January as well. And that's why we were so cautious, in whatever we were saying that, this pandemic is not over. I mean, that we have to really take into account future potential waves. Now, your question is, what can we do for, in terms of planning for future waves? I'll give you 3 actionable kind of points. One is that all the temporary centers that were, opened up during the second wave should be kept open for as long as it takes. From a cost benefit point of view, it makes no sense to shut down those additional centers. Why? Because you don't know when the next wave is coming. When it comes, it will be of use. There is a cost of depreciation of maintenance. But we've seen what's happened during this All India second wave. It's too bad if we get caught out again. So let's not close down those centers. Let's keep them open. We need to obviously ramp up the medical oxygen facilities. Virtually every hospital should have be very simply connected to manufacturing centers of medical oxygen. As I pointed out, districts have been doing this from September last year in anticipation of the second wave, right? And so all districts of India basically need to be doing that. I'll give you one thing which is definitely not being done right now and needs to be done. And this is something I've been arguing vehemently in various forums. I have a huge problem with the reported COVID numbers, both on cases and deaths. There's not much one can do on cases. That is, you have to test yourself to report as a case. But we know there's something kind of seriously flawed if our current system of counting a person as COVID dead only if that person has tested COVID positive, right? Because what we're saying is that what we see in our reported numbers is basically a function of testing capacity. Now think of rural India, which has very limited access to testing facilities of COVID. You can die of COVID and not be recorded as being COVID dead. So, thousands of people have died in the second wave who have not really taken that test. And so just because they've not taken the test doesn't mean that they did not die of COVID, right? So the reported numbers are seriously suspect during the wave. And we do have a way around this. India does have a real-time system of measuring deaths, which is called the civil registration system. That is, when you issue a death certificate, it leaves a number in our operating system for most states of India, especially Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, much of South India. Now, no state government is releasing those numbers on a daily basis, not even on a monthly basis. On the current release system, they're releasing it after 2 months, after 2 years, in a systematic fashion. Yes, the Tamil Nadu government does have a website which puts out these numbers, but they're not really showing you daily numbers. They're giving you a cumulative total of the entire year, right? So what I'm requesting governments is to release this number on a daily basis. The UK government has started doing this for many months now. The US government does this. All smart thinking countries are doing this. We also need to move to better reporting standards and release not just the COVID deaths, but all deaths, because that data will tell us where the deaths are actually going up. Now, just because a place has no testing facilities, you'll say that, oh, there's no COVID deaths out there. But those places, if they are actually affected by COVID, you will see it in the excess deaths number coming from the CRS system. And that is why that will be a better metric to gauge the pandemic than the reported number. So that's a simple actionable point which governments can do. But I think state governments are much smarter now. They're kind of once bitten, twice shy. A lot of them had kind of claimed victory after September last year. I think people are now hopefully. This book, I end with these two words: patience and humility. To get through a pandemic, these are the two key personality traits that you require. You can't, celebrate the end of a pandemic because you simply don't know if a future wave is coming. So you have to be humble. You have to say that, we don't know, but we're going to take all precautions possible. And the second is patience. There's a huge amount of patience that's required to get through a pandemic. The plague pandemic took about 25 years. Now, hopefully COVID is not, as long lasting, but one has to be patient to really understand and invest in science. The other thing on waves is also, by the way, to invest in detecting strains of the virus. We were very lax on that aspect between December and February. If we were more alert to the new strains of the virus, we would have, had a better early warning system. So better reporting of deaths, better monitoring of mutation of virus strains if they're happening, more sample collection, more seroprevalence surveys, so we know some estimate of what percentage of people have this thing. And of course, vaccination. It's a no-brainer that if the bulk of the population is vaccinated as quickly as possible, that is our passport out of this pandemic, in the sense that while the pandemic might still be there, it's going to cut down the severity and the deaths attributed to COVID-19 in a big way. And so vaccination is in a way the biggest, as the Prime Minister said, the biggest fight in this pandemic. And it's our duty to ensure that people are vaccinated, whoever are around us, and overcome vaccine hesitancy. In the 19th century also there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy, and you need good public communication. You need role models to demonstrate the effectiveness of vaccines and show the effectiveness of these vaccines demonstrated. I come across so many people in my day-to-day life who have still not taken the vaccine and are proud of it, saying that, oh, it's fine, we'll take our chances. But the fact is that this is a virus which is very deadly, and so we cannot really leave things to chance out here. And it's also that if you get the virus, you can spread it, right? So you getting vaccinated is not just to protect yourself; it's to protect a larger society. I think that message has to be conveyed better. The third question is on the rural-urban differences in a pandemic. The way to think about this is there are certain things that make a pandemic more deadly in urban areas, and there are certain things that make a pandemic more deadly in rural areas. The things that are bad for urban areas is density. We know that COVID-19, thrives on people are in high density kind of clusters. So it's going to rapidly spread, and poor ventilation and so on. In rural areas, much lesser density, right? So just the density argument makes a pandemic like COVID-19 much more dangerous for urban areas with respect to rural areas. Having said that, urban areas have better testing facilities, they have better medical facilities. So the health infrastructure is much better in urban areas than in rural areas. So think about the influenza. Influenza in 1918 had a much more devastating impact on rural India than on urban India. Why? Because with even some nourishment, some attention to care, you could tide over influenza. But in rural areas, those basic facilities were lacking, right? And it's my guess that when we get more information, we're going to see so many deaths in rural Indias, which were never tested positive of COVID, purely because people didn't have access to basic medical facilities, the oxygen, oximeters, and so on. And so this is the way to think about rural and urban, right? That is the urban, and there's no doubt that between wave 1 and wave 2 of COVID-19, wave 2 has been much more, it has penetrated rural areas much more, right? And so that's the way to kind of think about the rural-urban split in a pandemic.
Chinmay, shall I go ahead with other questions?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. How do we reduce the economic impact of pandemic? My question, of course, you have shown some pictures, but today media is playing a very big role today. What are your observations about media in fighting the pandemic? Social media gives a total of false information of COVID-19, vaccination, so on and so forth. That creates fear and anxiety in the people. What is more serious than the coronavirus and how to tackle this? So one is related to the whole media.
Yeah.
A few more questions I will place it before you so that it will be easy for you. Can you share some thoughts of reflection on the black marketing of the drugs that we are, experiencing today? Some drugs, they go underground or not made available. Now that the world population or the population of every country far greater than previous pandemics, what do you think of the effect it will have on pandemic? What was the reason for the rejection of John Snow's theory of water contamination as a reason for choice? And there are a few questions that are related to migration. So how, the migration has been affected by this pandemic, and, how the migrants can move again, to the, move to their source and destination back and forth for their work. So some questions are related.
I'll kind of pick and choose the questions. So on migration, because this is a topic close to my heart, I think we've done a much better job on migration this year than last year. Obviously, we've not got that kind of migration crisis. The trains are running. The trains, it's just not a means of transport. The trains, as I often said, is a psychological lifeline of Indian migrant workers. If you see the trains working, there's a hope that you can get around from point A to point B. And we shut down the railways, that sends out a very, very, disappointing signal to migrant workers, especially interstate migrant workers. I'm happy to say that, many more employers than last year have been much more responsible employers in ensuring social security for their migrant workers, going out of their way. I'm happy to see CREDAI, which is the real estate lobby of India, announce that they are planning to vaccinate 2 crore construction workers. Construction work is one of the huge segments which employs migrant workers. So the One Nation, One Ration card is supposed to be there, in policy. I don't think the take-up is there because I don't think migrant workers are aware of the policy. We need to do a better job of communicating that policy so that migrants historically could access ration only in their domicile, the place where they're born, can now access it anywhere. That's a fantastic policy which should be on the ground and that should be widely popularized. So there has been a lot of learning since last year. Things still have to be on the ground. But the vaccination of migrant workers is very critical because migrant workers go back and forth many times, more than one time in a year. So that the classic kind of potential ways of transmission of the pandemic is accelerated through migration. And so vaccinating migrant workers is going to get you, huge benefits than vaccinating people who are in that place and not moving around. So vaccination of migrant workers and employers picking up the tab for that is a very important thing going forward. We are an institute, IMM, but we just ran a vaccination drive for a lot of people. Many of us, had already got the vaccine before, but just today, we got an email saying 500 people, staffs, family, friends. Basically, if you have the access to the municipality as an employer, go ahead and vaccinate as many people. And most of these people are migrant workers, security guards, and so on. So you can do a lot also as an employer, right? And so one has to kind of take that responsibility. I think at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of us are migrants in some way or the other. But I think what the pandemic also demands is a lot of solidarity. And instead of blaming the government, one has to ask, well, what can I do? What can we do as organizations? This is also related then with the social media question, right? And the simple thing is, of course, as everyone knows, this is a pandemic of the virus, and then there's a pandemic of social media in the sense of the pandemic of misinformation, as it's called. Now, what can we do as individuals is just think twice before forwarding anything. I think that's a good principle in life in general, pandemic or no pandemic, but especially when it's pandemic-related information, consult some important people who are working in the space before forwarding stuff. And I'm going to use that social media question to link it with the stuff on black marketing, because I think these are very two related things. What we unfortunately saw, of course, I think the ICMR also needs to clarify as to why they prescribed those medicines, which later they, because I've been involved, I've been tracking this pandemic so closely, I've been interacting with public health officials. A lot of the medicines which were on that list, scientists have been saying for months on end, saying there is no evidence that they work, right? And so the question to ask is, why were they on the list? And so obviously, if they're on a list, which is mandated from the ICMR, and if the supply is not there, what you'll get is black marketing. It's economics 101. The real question to ask is, you should be having medical, advice which is only clinically approved, and not creating these false shortages in the market. There's so many things which are now not prescribed by the ICMR, right? Which was there just a month or two back. So we got that black marketing. If the root cause of that is, I wouldn't say, bad ethics. Obviously, there are going to be people who are going to try and profit, unfortunately. But the fact is that if those medicines were not on that list, arguably that whole mess would not have happened. And that got amplified through social media, because all of us were trying to help everyone we could. And we were all doing the same thing, forwarding, messages of what might help, how to run these medicines and so on. So it's all linked. We need clear protocols which have passed some basic scientific kind of proofs, and then have good communication through social media. So it's kind of all linked with this point on black marketing and social media. Thankfully, this time, we didn't really get that nonsense on super spreaders anymore. Last year there was a lot of talk of super spreaders and almost like a communal tinge given to the pandemic. I did not see too much of that. Quite frankly, I did not see anything of that. This time around. Maybe people have become more mature. People have realized that the pandemic doesn't, the virus really does not respect all these kind of things. So that's my broad take. That as individuals, all of us have to be more responsible before tweeting or posting stuff on social media. This question on Jon Snow, and it's why did they reject the waterborne theory? The officials in India saw that cholera was seasonal. And the fact is that, and I should point, this is a big debate about why cholera hit certain parts of India in certain months, right? And the reigning theory then was that, look, if cholera is waterborne, it should be there throughout the year, right? But why is cholera affecting only it? So it must be something to do with the air, something to do with the climate. And so you had all sorts of theories comparing it with, temperature, rainfall, all sorts of those. They have these long data tables in their reports and so on. I should also mention that the latest research on cholera suggests that there could be climatic factors which activate the bacteria in the water. Right? So these bacteria are floating around in marine ecosystems, that's been established, but they could be seasonal factors at play. So we now know, with the benefit of more than 100 years since those events, that it's quite possible that seasonal factors were important, like what the medical officials of India were saying, but there's no doubt that it is still essentially a waterborne disease. Right, which means it gets to the human beings through a medium of water. It's not coming through us through air, right? And so that's what the medical officials got wrong. So they were going through observations, but they were taking the wrong intuition because they were so hell-bent on this data that they were seeing, saying, if it is seasonal, how can it be related to what? And it was a kind of leap of faith that was required to say that it was. What they should have been seeing was the data for Europe, where cholera pretty much ended by the 1860s. The minute they got good water supplies for their cities, cholera ended. But in India, it took 60 more years. So it's unfortunate that our officials were stuck onto these theories. In my book, I mentioned this guy called Pettenkoffer, is a German sanitarian. Basically, there's a school of thought which said that good sanitation cuts down diseases. Now, there's no doubt that good sanitation matters, right? But they were so hell-bent on this idea that they said cholera can be attacked only through good sanitation, right? And all these other things don't matter. And the Indian medical officials followed this line of thought. And that particular sanitarian scoffed at John Snow's theory. He scoffed at the waterborne theory until the 1890s, right? And so there's a kind of a whole, like, if you're attracted to a particular hypothesis and the leading person of that field has been saying it for 20, 25 years, and the person's disciples all over the world, it's tough. It's tough to break that, scientific paradigm. I'll give you an example. Florence Nightingale. All of us know Florence Nightingale, famous person in the health professional field, wrote extensively on India, public health, by the way, and also lived very long. She lived, I think, for almost 90 years in the 19th century. She also maintained that, all this sanitation is important, nothing else. She was shown bacteria under the microscope in the 1890s. And it is only after that she changed her view and said that, look, we need to start accepting the modern science, right? And so that's how the paradigm shift was so big. It's only when people started, remember, today we take it for granted, stuff like microbes, stuff like these small things that are affecting our body. This was path-breaking stuff. This was completely going against thousands of years of traditional knowledge when it came about in the late 19th century. So unless people were shown the microscopes, the more powerful the microscopes, the more people could start observing. It took decades for the collective kind of knowledge to transfer. That's why this is an epochal moment in history. Because what we're doing today, how can we develop these vaccines today? It's thanks to the technologies developed by Robert Koch, Louis Pasteur, after which pasteurization, for example, is named, and so on. So that's why John Snow's theory was not accepted. And that's why MC Ferdinand, who, by the way, was in South India, he's at the Madras presidency. And by some accounts, he lost his job for propounding the correct theory, right? He wrote this pamphlet called Cholera and Water in India. When I went through that pamphlet, interestingly, he has a letter from the Maharaja of Travancore, who was supposed to be a progressive ruler. And the Maharaja of Travancore said, why don't you come and give us a presentation? So they were like, people who were trying to listen to these different theories, but eventually, in this case, by some accounts, he lost his job. So that's stubborn. So the Indian medical service, by the way, became a kind of a laughing stock because across the world, people had moved to the waterborne theory, and these guys had not. And it's only until Leonard Rogers, who's a member of the Indian Medical Service, invents this new method to cut down case fatality rates of cholera, that the respect for the Indian Medical Service comes back. So he kind of salvages the reputation of the Indian Medical Service. So that's broadly, and the economic impact. So what can we do to curb the economic impact? We have to realize these are desperate times. We did a huge fiscal push during the financial crisis of 2008. This is a much worse economic crisis, and our fiscal response is, in my view, simply not in line with how much is required. We need to, a classic measure in economics is the debt to GDP ratio, and the debt to GDP ratio of India, can go up substantially more than what it is right now. In the US and all, it's already way past 100%, because these are desperate times that call for desperate measures. So we have to basically inject more. We've been concerned with our fiscal push. I think has been much weaker than what's been mandated in this pandemic. So that's what we do. But I would say the vaccination is critical to get the economy back on track. Because if we go slow on vaccination, we are more likely to go into this cycle of lockdown, unlock, lockdown, unlock. And every time we go through the cycle, there's an economic impact. The more the vaccination, the less the lockdown, unlock cycle. Right? And so it's simple. The more the vaccination, the less the economic impact in the future. And that's why the vaccination is really the critical aspect about getting the economy back on track. All right, I'll stop here.
Yeah, last two questions, Chinmay. Okay, yeah. last two questions. The current corona pandemic affected the elderly first, 45 plus, elderly first, 60 plus, then 45 plus age group, and 18 plus age group now. So there is an apprehension below the 18 age group now. Was there a similar pattern during the influenza time? That is one question.
Yeah.
And second question related to the one, which is closer to your heart, migration. The first wave, raised the question, life and livelihoods. So in the first wave, our concentration was on the livelihoods of the migrants. This time the migrants are affected. They are dying. Last time they were not dying. The livelihoods was the, primary concern. So in the life and livelihoods, it is the life of the migrants which is very much threatened in the destination places, not in the source areas. At least source areas will cover them as part of their state and state agenda. So what your response to these questions here?
Again, two very, very nice questions. Most diseases do have an age impact. It's not like all ages have the same propensities to die. Right. So, for example, classically, influenza 1918 left a W-shaped signature on ages. That is, if you plotted death rates along age, it got a W-shaped signature, which means you had high death rates if you're very young. You had high death rates in the age group of 20 to 40, and you had high death rates at the age group 60 plus. Now, influenza back then led to pneumonic complications. There's some scientific explanation as to why we got this unique age structure kind of signature, but that was the one commonality of the influenza pandemic of 1918 observed around the world was the W-shaped signature. It's the death rates basically high, going low for the 10 to 20, then again going high, then again. So a W-shaped. So this is what we observe in epidemics. Now, every disease is unique. It has its own kind of signature. From what we know as of now, coronavirus still disproportionately affects the elder. I should also say that while we are saying that, people 45 plus were affected and so on, I am yet to come across a good research paper which identifies exactly what percentage of the population was affected. Because I'll tell you what happens out here. There is something called a selection bias, right? So what has happened is that between January and March, a lot of the 65 plus people got actually vaccinated, right? So actually they were at less risk. So what you might see in the data, in fact, there's some evidence to suggest this, that the vaccinated people who were 65 plus were not so much affected in the second wave. And so people who are affected in your data basically will show more than of 40, 50s who are affected. And so you might interpret that this pandemic is affecting the 40s and 50s more than what it was during the first wave. But remember, there's a big difference between the first wave and second wave, is that many more 65 plus people were vaccinated in the second wave. So one has to wait. I'm not going to, agree with this proposition that there is a difference in the age selectivity of the different waves of the pandemic, because I have seen no research paper which establishes this conclusively. There is anecdotal evidence. Yes, I know many people who are young and who have died, right? But this is still anecdotal. We have to see it as percentages. Many old people have also died, right? So you have to see it as in terms of percentages. Whether it is going to affect younger children or not, again, the scientific evidence, there is virtually no scientific evidence right now which suggests that in the future it will affect younger children more. The only way it might happen is again through vaccination, in the sense that if even a tiny fraction of people in the say age group of 20 to 30 or say 10 to 20 are being affected by COVID, the fact is that if the 40 plus population gets vaccinated, obviously the death rates of this younger age group will start looking higher. But that is an artificial construction of the data. It is not a natural consequence of the pandemic. So one has to be very careful in how we are interpreting the age selectivity of the pandemic. On this question of migrants and mortality, it is true that a lot of migrants are dying. This is a mortality crisis more than a migration crisis that we saw last year. I should also say migrants also had a different decision choice this year than last year. Last year, they said, let's just go back home. This year, because the wave also went in rural areas, often migrant workers were making a choice of, between the devil and the deep sea. This was a choice made in Bombay in the plague, because there was a famine in Ratnagiri district. And they said, should we stay here and get hit by plague, or should we go back and die of a famine? Right? So this is the kind of classic migration choice. And a lot of migrant workers decided to stay back in cities this time around, much more than last time. Again, I don't have the data on death rates of migrants versus non-migrants. I can't really say that migrants have been more hit than non-migrants. But there's no doubt, I think the question is, because migrants don't have a political voice in destination regions, their deaths might just go much more unaccounted, or somehow might not be getting that much more policy importance. Now, that's a valid point. But I would just say that the number of deaths has been so much, and so much has gone unaccounted as non-COVID deaths, that this is a larger question which includes migrants and non-migrants. And so we have to really press all our state governments to release the all-cause mortality numbers, so that we get a sense of really how many people have died. Because the numbers for Madhya Pradesh and Andhra Pradesh are shocking. They're showing something like 5 times the normal death rate in the month of May. These are numbers I have last seen in November 1918. I'm saying that May 2021 was about as bad as November 1918 in terms of an abnormal shock. Right? It's the numbers that we are seeing is disproportionately low to the actual shock that we saw in the month of May. Now, it's not the 20 million people have definitely not died. That was a number, 1918, but the number is definitely not 200,000. It is much, much more than 200,000.
Yeah, I think that brings to an end our discussion, and that was a wonderful presentation, Chinmay, in retrospect and prospect, and being in IIM Ahmedabad and bringing history so forcefully, makes a person like me so happy that we need people like you to tell us, some of the most important issues and connecting it with history. So you are doing a great service, and thank you for that. And taking this opportunity to thank you for your time and for your presentation. And our audience, they are all academics from central universities, researchers, and many of them. So definitely they all would have benefited by the questions that you received. It is evident that all of them have received it well. Surely they will be after you, after this lecture. So thank you, Chinmay, for that. And I take this opportunity to thank our principal, Reverend Dr. Thomas, for his support and encouragement for all the webinars. And he himself would be there for every seminar and every webinar. And thank you, Father, for that. And to all the participants, you have been your support has been overwhelming, and you have been participating in all our programs. And we thank you all, and be with us in all our academic journeys like this. To Father, to thank the team headed by Father Justin, Dr. Xavier, Samson, Aguilan, and Victor for all the arrangements made from the day they designed the invitation to that of the today live streaming in YouTube. You have done everything, so thank you very much for all the work related to this being done so well. And we thank every one of you for that. And once again, Chinmay, thank you for taking your time off. It is not a cliche. It is not a usually say that busy timing, taking off from busy. It's really you have taken time from your busy schedule. I know that, and thank you very much. And we will keep in touch. Please be in touch with us, and do come to Loyola sometime when you visit Chennai.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chinmay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.